Okay, I think we're good. Okay, start again.
Okay. Hey guys. Yep, thanks for coming out. Not a lot of people in person. Last week we had like maybe 15 people.
Oh.
So it kind of fluctuates. Sorry about that. But there's more people online this time. So
yeah,
maybe
there's like 11 online.
Yeah. Yeah, so we have Kartik with Satsearch tonight. We ran into him at the Space Tech Expo a couple weeks ago in Long Beach. That was pretty cool. Good to see you again, Kartik.
Yeah, so Kartik first presented with us back in 2016. Now he's back, and we're excited to hear what new journeys he's been through. So, everyone, this is Kartik.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks again for the invitation, and I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay. Is it better that I'm sitting or I'm standing for the recording?
Just
Okay, cool. Okay, so the topic that I proposed for... Oh, there's a bit of echo here. Do we need to turn...
turn that down.
Okay. So the topic that I proposed to address in this talk was this whole concept of space commercialization, which I think is, if you're watching the news and following anything that's especially come out in the last couple of years, I don't think you can avoid the fact that there is this theme of space commercialization, whether it's humans going into space, whether it's exploring deep space, whether it's using satellites to do all kinds of things to help improve life on Earth. And so this is exciting, and it's drawing a lot of people to the industry. It's drawing a lot of investors. It's giving a lot of people the opportunity to explore being in the space sector. And I think there's also a lot of unknowns about what actually the future is going to hold. There's, of course, a few forcing functions on this. And so what I wanted to start with is kind of, a lot of people talk about space commercialization, but I think what's a little difficult is there isn't really a common definition yet of what it means to commercialize space. So I decided to start with the simplest thing, which is the dictionary definition, right? So if you look on, this is the Cambridge Dictionary, commercialization is defined as the organization of something in a way intended to make a profit. Now, that is actually already kind of challenging in the space sector, because if you look historically at how the space sector has been organized, there's been a lot more about developing capabilities to launch satellites, to get satellite data down, to do something interesting with it, to send humans into deep space, and not so much the topic of how are we going to make a profit. In fact, I would say, coming from the engineering world, especially in the space sector, the notion of making profit has been taboo, I think, for quite a while. This also has to do with the fact that a lot of space activities have traditionally been funded by governments, which means taxpayer money, and there's a little bit of this taboo about making profit while you're taking government money and you're building something that's supposed to be for humanity, right? So I think this this was necessary in a lot of ways to get this industry off the ground and to do a lot of the very high risk things that were necessary over the 50s, 60s, 70s through to sort of the end of the 90s. But I think what was clear is that there was some sort of ceiling there. If all we were going to do was build a space sector that was based off of governments funding projects top down, essentially giving satellite integrators or launch vehicle integrators big projects, and for them to then go and subcontract smaller and smaller companies, that was sort of a hierarchy that had some level of limit. It was limited by government budgets, by geopolitics, by a whole other range of factors. But in the last 20 years, people have been tinkering with the idea that it's at least worth investigating if there's something more to the space sector than that. And I think that comes from people's passion to do more. There's a lot of people, I think, who believe we can do a lot more good things with space technology, using space assets, using space data. And then I think it was also that there's been some technology breakthroughs that have enabled people to start thinking a little bit more about how can we do something that starts grassroots and we kind of find our way towards something that ultimately perhaps even makes a profit, right? So the interesting thing is that journey sort of started serendipitously in the academic environment. My background is in aerospace engineering, so I went through sort of a classic path studying aerospace engineering at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, doing kind of hard physics and calculus and a whole bunch of other things, and then working on hands-on projects. And one of the hard things is when you're talking about building satellites and your satellites cost $500 million, it's hard in an academic environment to give students a hands-on experience of working with satellites, right? You're not going to put a student on working on a piece of hardware that costs tens of millions of dollars. So this forced the hand of academics, and particularly a couple of professors, to think about, well, is there something that we can give students that gets them a flavor of what it means to work on big satellites? This ultimately led to the CubeSat standard, and it was intended as an educational tool. But as you see with many other things, right? Arduino is another good example. Raspberry Pis are a very good example as well. Raspberry Pis were originally also intended to be low-cost computers for schools, in developing countries where they don't necessarily have the resources to buy big computers, and allowing students to get access to computing without having to spend thousands and thousands to get a computer. But what we've seen with something like the Raspberry Pi is as soon as you commoditize something like that, so compute, and you put it in the hands of a lot of people, people get creative and they start doing all kinds of crazy things with it. So that's what kind of the CubeSat movement did, is you ended up with, it started with an educational tool that was cheaper, gave people a hands-on experience, and as people got access to that, they were like, wait a second, so I can now experiment, I can try things, I can invent new ideas. And that led to basically people starting to launch cheaper satellites. There was I did a stint at NASA Ames out in California, and while I was there was a project called PhoneSat, where the idea was, well, smartphones are becoming powerful enough, and this was a decade ago. What if I just stick a smartphone in a box with a battery pack and I launch it into space, right? So the ability to do an experiment like that just for the sake of it is kind of what is characterizing this commercialization of space, and particularly what is termed new space, right? So a lot of people talk about new space, and I think you'll get, if you ask 10 different people, you get 10 different definitions of what new space means. To me, this is what it characterizes. It characterizes that spirit of trying new things and leveraging the fact that we have certain technological progress, certain scales in economics and accessibility, distribution, that allows you to say, you know what, I'm going to build a satellite, and I don't have to raise $100 million. I don't have to raise $500 million. I can join with a group of friends, and we're all enthusiastic, and we're going to put money together and buy the equipment and hardware and build our first pocket cube or our first flatsat. In fact, there's a number of amateur radio groups that do exactly this. So AMSAT is a good example. AMSAT is working on amateur radio satellites, right? And even if they just serve as beacons in space, they're providing, and I don't really like the word, but I think it's apt here, they're democratizing access to the ability to get stuff into space. And I think that's exciting, because when that happens, you start having people being creative and inventing, where failure now, quote unquote, is allowed. Meaning if you do an experiment and it doesn't work out, you're not out $1 billion, right? So when you can do that and you can start experimenting, then you can, I think, start thinking about this word profit. So can I do something? Can I find something that's interesting enough? And can I understand how I can do it and the value I can generate that allows me to effectively charge more than it costs me to produce? So this led to companies like Planet Labs and Spire and others popping up, because they graduated out of that thought process saying, well, if it costs me this much to build a satellite that can do this thing, and I understand that there's value to a certain community, I can now, for a fraction of the cost, launch not just one of them, but 10 of them or 100 of them. And I can start doing things that were previously not possible, or things that were possible previously, but just weren't driven by what the market needed, right? So that's kind of what the situation was at the start of the 2010s. And then we saw for a period of sort of 5 years that model graduating, and a number of investors coming into the sector where they said, well, if that's the model, I know how to finance that, because I can understand if it costs this much and there's this much scale and there's these milestones and you can make a profit off of it, then I can get people in the banking sector interested. I can get venture capitalists interested. I can get people with a bit of extra cash interested to support these ideas, because ultimately there is an opportunity to commercialize. So with that kind of having brought us to, let's say, 2015 or so, I think what's happened in the last 5 or 6 years is you've now seen people go even bigger than that to say, look, we're not just thinking about launching a number of CubeSats. Now that that has been done, what are the next big milestones? What if we extrapolate even further and we look into the future and we start looking at all of these scales, technology scales, financial scales, people scales as well, like many more people coming into the industry. What does that allow us to do when we have that much talent available? So this is kind of the picture today, right? And this graphic here is specifically very US focused, but I wanted to kind of add a caveat to this, that this picture, although in the US you see maybe the most prominent headlines happening, this is happening and being replicated all over the world. Meaning, on the left you see Starship, right? And hopefully we'll see Starship come online soon. And the question is, what can you do when launch costs are dropping so precipitously that you can basically launch something into space and not worry about what it's costing you anymore? And I think that's what, SpaceX is bringing to the market, is the ability to say, I want to grab an Uber to the other side of the city. I don't have to calculate it anymore because it's within my range and I can do it on a whim almost. So if Starship brings down the cost so precipitously that you can just launch it just for the sake of trying something, then the question is how much is that going to transform the industry? And of course, SpaceX is not the only player out there, whether it's Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic. And then in the last few weeks, there's been some interesting announcements of space stations, right? So Axiom Space kind of led this idea of what's going to happen after the ISS, after the International Space Station. So what's going to happen when governments decide we can't fund the ISS anymore, we're not going to refurbish it anymore. And so Axiom started sort of around that 2016 period with, in fact, one of the main people managing the ISS program at NASA basically realizing, look, access to space is becoming cheaper and cheaper and more available, and the underlying technologies are becoming more and more available, that we can now think about, what if that's a commercial play? What if that's not a government play, that's a commercial play? So Axiom has sort of been working on that for the last 5 years, and they've been doing it with a very clear business plan, sending people first to the ISS, then they're going to dock elements to the ISS, they're going to undock and have then their commercial station, which they will grow. And so now, in the last few weeks, we've seen a few other space stations being announced. One is this Voyager Nanoracks Lockheed announcement that they're going to launch Starlab, right? They've got a whole business plan behind it. Voyager is a really interesting outfit. They're going to go public. They're actually going to go public the traditional route, an IPO, and they've got a business plan. They've got financiers, and they're thinking big, right? And they've built this on the back of a business plan. And then just a matter of a few days ago, actually this week, we had the announcement of Orbital Reef, which is Blue Origin and a number of other providers, including Sierra, Redwire, and others, coming together to talk about, another competing, quote unquote, competing commercial space station. So we've gone from that CubeSat 15 years ago that released people to start thinking about, wait, I can put something in space at a fraction of the cost that I could before. I can do that. Like I don't have to wait for government funding to the tune of $100 million to get something into space. That led to sort of the CubeSats going up, the constellations. That matured. We saw venture capital coming into the industry because people started talking about commercialization, and it's become less and less taboo and more commonplace to talk about profit in the space industry. And it's becoming systemic, which is good. People are thinking about, well, if you're going to send something to space, how are you going to make money off of this, right? And now we're seeing sort of the next leg of that. So people are saying, well, now we can get to space and we can launch satellites. That's done, right? Like, that's almost quote unquote commodity. Like, we can just buy that off of the industry. So what is the next milestones that we want to get to? So here you see a picture which is, basically the US picture of, where the future, part of where the future is going. And the interesting thing is, this is happening in a whole bunch of countries. You could build this graphic in a whole bunch of countries. It might not equally be as mature in all the different facets, but this picture can be replicated, which I think is also super interesting, because that means you're talking about global growth of the industry. So not just territorial growth, but global growth. But the thing is, for this to happen, so for any of these things to fly, what has to happen is most of these companies, and SpaceX is a little bit of an edge case for some reasons, but most of these companies, what they're doing is they're trying to focus on integrating these systems, getting them in orbit, operationalizing them, and selling products and services, right? And generating out of that margin and profit and building a sustainable long-term business. But to do that, they don't want to be the ones that are, for instance, digging the raw materials out of the ground and processing them, and then building the tiny widgets that get integrated into the bigger widgets that ultimately become part of the rocket or the space station or whatever else it is. So where does that come from? What are they leaning on? They're leaning on, and of course, Murphy's Law. So I did a good job of, here you go.
Try the show anyway.
Oh, there you go.
One of your images is gone.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the images is dropped. But the point that I was going to make is all of these companies rely on a rich industrial base of component manufacturers, parts manufacturers, people who do testing and qualification, people who build sub-assemblies. There's an entire gamut of expertise, technologies, and companies out there that are dedicated towards specialist equipment and services that enable those companies that are thinking big to achieve what they're doing, right? But fundamentally, based on the way the industry is organized and has traditionally been organized, it turns out if you want to be able to rapidly launch a satellite and buy stuff and manage supply chain and delivery and all of that stuff, you have to have an understanding of how the supply chain works. And you have to be able to procure, and you have to be able to understand, well, if I buy this thing, it's going to be delivered in X number of days. It's actually going to work. I'm going to be able to integrate it, and I'm going to be able to launch my stuff. Because that's been very difficult traditionally, that's where, in a lot of the ways, the reason why government funding was necessary early, I think, because the government funding is what helped to de-risk the fact that enough money was going into the system to enable people to focus on building their expertise around all these parts, so that there was a guarantee that when the International Space Station was launched, that the sum of the parts was going to work, basically. But we have 50 years of heritage doing that. And so the question is, are we in a position in which we can do that independent of the government? Is there enough understanding to say, look, if somebody wants to buy a widget from a company, that company can deliver it? And you don't need necessarily the government as the de-risker in that equation. So this comes a little bit to our story as a company as well, because as an engineer, working on space missions and trying to come up with designs for satellites that we're going to launch, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out where all these parts were and where these manufacturers were. And on the one side, I was doing complex engineering, maths and physics and whatever I needed to do. And on the other side, I was spending hours and hours basically Googling for stuff and spending hours trying to figure out where are these manufacturers, what do they actually do, how do I get them to understand what I need, how do I even understand if their stuff works or not. Ultimately, the conclusion that I came to working on a range of projects was that buying and selling in the space industry just sucks. And particularly, I was on the buy side, and I was, as an engineer, trying to understand, okay, I need this star tracker. Who has star trackers out there? What performance specifications do they have? Can they deliver it to me within the time frame that I need it? If I need 1 unit now and I need 6 units 6 months from now, are they going to be able to scale with me and deliver? I was personally frustrated because I realized I was hitting my head against a brick wall every day trying to tackle this. And that led me to the thought that, well, there must be a better way to do this, because if in my daily life I can go on to Amazon and buy, whatever it is I need, books, shoes, etc., or if I can, well, today you can go online and you can buy a Tesla, or you can even buy a house, right, on Zillow or Redfin. So it's not just like small items. People are using the internet to do all kinds of complex transactions. So the question I had was, well, in this frontier industry, why are we stuck like looking through PDF documents and trying to email people and even fax people? I've had to fax stuff. And that's where I realized, well, I'm willing to try and figure out why this problem hasn't been fixed, and hopefully we find a way to fix it. And if we don't fix it, hopefully we'll figure out why it isn't possible to fix it. And I had enough faith with my team to say, you know what, it's worth trying to figure out if there's a way to fix this. Because coming back to what I was saying previously, if you're going to build commercial space stations and you're going to rely on suppliers who are delivering widgets, and you're going to rely on those widgets being able, being delivered on time, performing as they should, being reliable, and that the buying and selling process is not the interesting piece of what you're doing, right? It is ultimately this business you're building, the services or the products and services you're going to sell, the margins you're going to make. This has to become a solved problem, was kind of the thesis that we had. But when we started this project back in 2016, a lot of the pushback was, well, we made it to the moon doing what we've been doing. So why should we do something different? We managed fine in like the 70s, 80s, 90s. We built the space station, we had the shuttle program. It's not broken. We build stuff and it gets to space. So why fix something that isn't broken? And really what it came down to was, we got stuff to space, but how painful was it? How painful was the process to do it? And when we went down to micro level, we realized, and we talked to a lot of people, that the frustration I had as an engineer at my desk permeates the industry. There's a lot of people very, very frustrated. And that's the reason why we realized, look, it's not a question of why fix something if we've been able to go to space. It was more a question of, if we fix this, how much more can we do? Right? And it's with that ambition that we kind of said, okay, that's the real reason to try to fix this. And so the backdrop to this is, the question is there a forcing function even forcing us to consider what's a reason to do this? And the real reason is, and there's lots of market projections. This graph is from a Morgan Stanley study. There's a bunch of other studies out there. But there are things going on in the market that are showing that there is an appetite for growth. There's a lot of unsolved problems relating to business models and sustainability of companies, but there's clearly an appetite. I won't get into now. I think there's all kinds of reasons why that appetite is emerging. But the fact is that, for instance, there's capital inflow into this sector. Just so far this year, I just looked it up, about $10 billion have been invested in from private sources into the space industry. That is a significant amount of money compared to what was coming into the industry even 5 years ago. The other interesting thing is space companies have started going public. That means there's an opportunity for space companies to be rolled into what retail investors get access to and what institutions get access to. So how is that going to affect the ability for the...
Don't thump the table.
Oh, okay. How is that going to affect the ability for the space industry to scale? And then I like this example. What happens, and SpaceX has this crazy idea, it costs tens of thousands of dollars now in general to get a kilo to orbit. SpaceX is talking about dropping that down to $100 per kilo. What is that going to do when you can pay to get to orbit on your credit card, right? So these are all reasons why, if this is happening, our belief is, well, then you need to be able to buy and sell better right now, because this money is going to come into the industry and require companies to operate faster and more lean and generate revenue and pay back investors and close business models. So you can't have thousands of engineers just Googling all day and wasting that time. So that's a little bit the thesis that we had and the little piece that we're trying to play in helping the industry commercialize. But even forgetting about us, I wanted to just paint the picture of this is what I think, in my view at least, what sets the scene for what space commercialization is and what the challenge is for us. Is there's an opportunity here because there's an appetite, but there's a bunch of challenges that we have to overcome to enable us to get to the point where we have half a dozen, maybe a dozen commercial space stations as one example of one vertical within the industry. By 20, all of those space stations are talking about being operational before the end of the decade. How do we do that? So this is a bit our conclusion and a plug of what we're doing at Satsearch, is that our belief is that one vital cog in this is that to do this, the sector needs a commercial marketplace to drive that growth. And there's no better way to do that at scale by taking advantage of digital and the internet, right? And every industry has sort of found a way to make use of the internet, or is in the process of finding out a way to use the internet to achieve scale. So if you are interested in what we're doing, you're welcome to go to our website. What we've effectively built and we're trying to build is almost an e-commerce experience for space engineers. So I can go online, I look for a reaction wheel, I find it, I can see what other ones are available, and I can even proceed to buy it, right? And I can go into, if people are interested later in the discussion, what it means to buy stuff in the space industry, because there's a whole lot of complexity there. But that's the future that we're building towards. Is what happens when that's all an engineer needs to do is in a few clicks they can buy stuff, and they can on their credit card pay for stuff, and on their credit card book their launch slot on the next Starship flight, and a month later the stuff is in orbit. What does that mean for what we can do in space and for Earth, right? So I just wanted to paint a picture, because this sounds interesting and great, but what have we been doing in the last 6 years, and what's happened since I was here last giving a talk? Does anybody care that this is what we believe is the way forward for space commercialization? So I think the only way I could really show that is to show the number of people using our website, right? So this is over the last few years, the growth in engineers that are using our website. So we are sort of touching on 15,000 people every month that are using the site from over 100 countries. And that's why we have really strong data showing that picture that I painted of what's happening, for instance, here in the US, that's being replicated in a whole bunch of different countries. And okay, they're at different stages of maturity. Some places, you've got space agencies and programs. In other places, you're talking about the very first satellite being built and a group of enthusiasts at a university building the first CubeSat. But we know that story. We know that story for 50 years ago. So if we are willing to accept that can be replicated the last 15 years, then what we're talking about is commercialization going on in basically every corner of the globe. So this is our evidence that yes, there is commercialization going on, and underlying all of this, there's a lot of interesting insights into what's actually happening in the marketplace. And so on our side, what we do is through the marketplace, the idea is we're trying to help buyers buy better and suppliers sell better. And so we work with a whole host of companies. This is just to show you that we're working with companies that are understanding that this is an opportunity to scale, right? And I think scale is the important word here, because Elon talks about scale, OneWeb and Planet Labs and Spire, they talk about scale. we're talking about another element of scale, which is in the marketplace transactions. And I think that's the question that everyone is sort of trying to figure out. I think it's going to take us a decade or so to fill in the gaps in this puzzle. And I'm confident that 10 years from now, we're going to turn around and a number of those scale problems are going to be solved, or they're going to be at least well understood. So that's a bit what we're trying to do. And I think there's a whole host of these scale challenges that need to be addressed in the space sector. Another simple example is if you launch all of these satellites and you have these petabytes and petabytes of data, and that's growing astronomically. How are we going to deal with that scale? What are we going to do with that data? How are we going to be able to build the infrastructure to bring all of that down to Earth? If we can't, are we going to be able to process it on orbit? What kinds of scale can we build in software and hardware that allows us to deal with this exploding volume of data that's being generated on orbit and do something useful with it? Okay, so I'm going to end with just giving you, from our perspective, some of the challenges we've noticed for the work that we're doing that I think translates to some of the bigger challenges we're seeing relating to commercialization. So this is the biggest one that we've noticed. If you ask the average space company when, as they're working on a project, who they work with, what you'll find if you dig deep is that there is a lot leaning on the idea that companies want to work with people that they trust. And that has to do with the fact that space is difficult. Space is high risk as it is, right? Stuff fails, the space environment is harsh, you have to deal with funding issues, launchers can explode on the launch pad. So companies are used to de-risking as much as they can, and part of the thing that they don't want to deal with is unknown quantities when it comes to organizations and people and way of working. So sort of the traditional way of doing this is essentially saying, look, I know you, you know me, let's just work together, and we're not even going to bother looking at what else is available in the marketplace because it's too high risk. There's not enough de-risking that trust. And what you end up with is people who don't know that there's an open marketplace with many options that they can evaluate. So getting people to think in that commercial way about what's available on the marketplace and appreciate the value of competitive pressures, basically, is hard. What we've noticed is it just comes down to finding ways to build that trust in a different way. So it's not about telling people you need to do things where you're taking high risk, because that just doesn't work. It comes to, well, this trust that you've built in a way that doesn't scale, right? 5 people in the industry that you work with, but you really, to scale your program, you need to know 500 people. You need to know 5,000 people that you're working with on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. So how do you scale that trust? How do you work with, not 20 suppliers, but 200 suppliers, 2,000 suppliers, and still be able to say, I'm doing this? So that's a major challenge for commercialization, I think, in general, in the sector. And so another way of asking this is, what is it going to take for true commercialization to happen in this industry? And I've got 5 points that I wanted to end on. So I'll just read them out and quickly give you my comment. And this was intended to be also, hopefully, starting point for discussion. But these are the things that I personally, from what we've been doing through Satsearch and my work prior to that in the industry, has sort of given me as insight. One is the ability to forecast the market. Without the ability to forecast the market, companies are precarious, basically, because your most important thing is to secure your order book. You've got a certain number of sales you're making every month, quarter, or year, and your biggest thing is to make sure that those don't go away. And that comes from an inability to forecast the market. And an inability to forecast the market makes it hard for everybody. It makes it hard for the individual companies. It makes it hard for investors. It makes it hard for governments as well. So that's one thing, is without the ability to forecast the market, you have a fundamental issue of existence, and everyone is sort of on the defensive as a result. Secondly, the boldness to build for scale. I think we're just starting to see this happening with ingredients coming into play where people are willing to talk about scale and to fund scale and to operate at scale. And there's a few key ingredients. Launch capacity and the cost of launch and launch availability is a very important one. But there's a whole host of other ones. For instance, what's happening in the ground station market is also really interesting. So the capacity for sending data up and down to space has to scale as well. And so you're seeing now companies building ground infrastructure, putting ground antennas in place, data centers, etc. For instance, Amazon has stepped into this market. So AWS is building ground station because they can see an opportunity to scale. So I think build for scale is really essential for commercialization. The third piece is, because most ventures in the space industry have traditionally been funded by the government, what you see is they're funded for the IP that engineers have developed. For instance, in an academic lab, they get a small business research grant, they get spun off, they might get some national funding, they might win some prizes. So the characteristic of the space industry that we've encountered is most companies are very engineering heavy and not much else. And for commercialization, and I think the IT sector is the best example of this. My brother works at Cisco. If you look at how they think of commercialization, they are led by sales. They're led by the sales team. Okay, there's some core IP there. There's technology that's been de-risked. But they hire for and they operate on the basis of sales is what is going to make us whole and make our business plan whole, make our investors happy, make us able to pay our payroll, make us be able to invest in the next generation of the technology. So they are led by sales. And quite frankly, we don't have enough salespeople in this sector to really commercialize. So we have to attract that talent. Fourthly, this reticence that we've noticed, which is to operate on the open market, has to dissipate. So the idea that the business of space is about being inward and looking at grants and governments and looking at your local ecosystem, for scale, companies have to be willing and people have to be willing to look global, right? And in some sense, borders have to disappear the same way it's happened in most commercial industries where you see supply chains are truly global. And that has to be ideally not orchestrated by a single operator, so a government that is orchestrating like the International Space Station, which is international. But what you actually want, what I would say is you want business to business internationalization. You want company A in Brazil talking to company B in Japan, transacting for something that's going to fly on a rocket built by a company in, I don't know, Lithuania and operated by a company in Paraguay. I don't know. So that focus on the open market, I think, has to change in the industry. And then the last and the most important one is we have to bring more people into this sector, because in my view, the biggest limit on scale that we're going to hit, the one that we're going to hit the fastest, is that we don't have enough people and we don't have the diversity of talent required in the industry to scale. I think we're starting to see the scales of technology, the scales of finance, and other scales being built, but the scale of the workforce has not yet been tackled. So my kind of final note on this is, if you are not in the space industry and you're wondering whether there's a spot for you in the space sector, there is. I'm undoubtedly 100% there is. The question is, how do you navigate to the one that suits you the best? Not a question of, is there a role for me? And this is what I tell everybody wherever I go, is don't doubt that there's a role for you in the space sector. It's more a tactical question of where can you land that you're happy, that you can add value, and you're part of something that makes sense for you and the organization. So anyway, I want to end on that. I think I took longer than I had intended to. But this is a little bit of our story, my personal story of, this journey of commercialization and what we're sort of doing at Satsearch with a view towards this larger vision of commercialization. And I hope this provided you with some new insights, and I'm happy to, even after this event, if you have any questions, to you can connect with me on LinkedIn, you can drop me an email, you can find me on Twitter. Just feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to help in any way I can. Thanks.
Thanks, Kartik.
I took a little longer than I intended, but
Does anybody have any questions?
I have one. On all your slides it says confidential. You are aware that this is being live streamed.
yeah. I realized that as I'd opened it now. That's there as just a watermark that I needed to remove for the deck. It's in the template.
So people online, we can't hear you right now.
And there's some stuff in the chat. Oh, okay. It's just
Better
people
put
saying
your
hi.
questions in the chat.
Let me stop sharing.
But,
Okay, I see. What role do you see blockchain and distributed ledgers playing in the marketplace for space development and exploration? Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, because I think, blockchain in general is something that the world at large is trying to figure out, right? What are the right applications? And so I think it would be actually a miss for the space industry to not explore that. So I think people exploring that is good because it normalizes the space industry as being a place to test that out, just like every other sector is trying to figure out how distributed ledgers will change the way they do business, the way they scale, things like that. So maybe this question is triggered by the fact that I had a slide that said that one of the most important things in this industry is trust, right? And so my understanding of blockchains is they allow you to operate and have the properties of trust without requiring trust, so having this trustless guarantee at scale. And so, yeah, there are applications that come to just pure financing of space projects, perhaps, all the way to things relating to supply chain provenance and having, things like supply chain handoffs and auditing and stuff tracked. And then, Elon said that Doge is going to the moon. So, people are also trying crazy ideas. So I think the world is your oyster. And I hate to be skeptical, although as an engineer, I'm skeptical in general about things, mostly because I like to understand them better. But my skepticism, for instance, around blockchain is not because I don't think that there's something useful to be done, but actually because I think we need a whole bunch of people probing at it before we figure out what the applications are. So yeah, I would encourage you, if you're in that, in the blockchain space and interested in the space industry, I don't have the killer app. I don't know yet really where it's going to be. We've thought about it, of course, marketplaces, and we're dealing with supply chain. Maybe down the road there'll be applications for us relating to distributed ledger as well. But yeah, I hope that answers the question. I don't know if anybody else here also has thoughts on this. Maybe that's interesting.
I think not blockchain. I like blockchain. I don't like NFTs.
Okay.
It's probably still early days for that kind of stuff to be added. Crypto spaceships, but like two converging industries that down the road type thing. I agree with you.
Yeah. So we'll see. But at the same rate, I think if somebody wants to try it, it's probably good to try it, because we'll learn one way or another what it means. Okay, so there's a question here from Kevin. You talk about all of these cheap launches. What about coordination and debris removal? Yeah, fantastic question. So the project that I was working on before I ended up starting Satsearch was a European project, and I was developing a mission concept for multi-target active debris removal of rocket upper bodies. In particular, discarded stages of Ariane rockets that are in some precarious orbits. And so the reason I ended up with Satsearch, so the last straw was I spent 2 weeks trying to look for a LiDAR system for our guidance, navigation, and control design, and I just couldn't get a response from anybody, and I was spending 2 weeks just trying to read through random stuff I was finding online. So that sort of triggered me that, onto Satsearch. But what I meant to say with this is I have some sort of like close experience with the question of debris removal and management of the debris population. And this is a really interesting question because I think it has a lot of parallels to climate change. It is, I think, got a lot of similarities to, the classic game theoretical tragedy of the commons, sort of wicked problems as they're sort of classified as, which means that as the industry scales, what also scales is the negative externalities, and also as a result, the cost to address them. So clearly climate change 50 years ago would have been cheaper to solve than it is today. And clearly 50 years from now, it's going to be more expensive than it is today. So it then comes to a question of when is there critical mass in the cohort of the population to decide this is untenable, right? And hopefully we're reaching that now with climate change. And I think it's actually teaching us something in the space sector because people are aware of that. So people are asking this question of what does it mean for debris removal when we're going to have a launch every week, or as a company like Astra is talking about a launch every single day. That's going to scale a lot of things, including negative externalities. So things like the probability of collisions, the actual number of collisions that happen, the debris clouds that are generated, the collisional cascade that can come from that, which is something like people like to talk about, the Kessler syndrome. So I think this is a question of what do we want to do as society? And in fact, I think the most important piece in this, and we've seen this in a number of other industries, is you want the regulators to step in. So you want the regulators to say, look, there's a sanction for polluting space, as an example. As a result, you create then a market for cleanup, or you create a market for people to stop polluting, because if the economics make sense, where the sanction is large enough that people say it's cheaper to clean up, then you start creating markets, right? So there's a bunch of companies that are waiting for that. The question is, are the regulators there? Are we going to see, based on the geopolitical environment, regulations come in that do this? Or, right, that's the top-down approach. Or is there a way to crowdsource this, to have enough groundswell where people care enough that they're, like here in the US, I guess, they're writing to their congressperson saying, you got to get, on the legislation, something that stops all of this stuff being launched into space and causing not just debris, but also polluting the night sky, right? So you can't do your astrophotography and also more, professional astronomy or whatever it is. So I think those two things need to happen: coordination from the ground level and coordination through governments. And the fact of the matter is that I think it's inevitable, right? It's inevitable that the arc of history is that you see things when they become useful and you see these scale factors emerge, that they're unavoidable. They will scale and people will figure out ways to scale them. So if we take it for granted that we are going to have a lot of cheap launches and we're going to have, as a result of a lot of launches, I don't like the idea of sticking our head in the mud and saying, well, maybe there's a way that we can stop cheap launches from happening. I just don't think we're there anymore. We've passed the tipping point and we're going to have a lot of launches. So taking that as a fact, I think we have to now talk about, well, given that we're going to have a lot of cheap launches and a lot of satellites being launched, what do we need to do to protect the environment? And I feel part of the industry is still stuck in, no, it's not a foregone conclusion that the industry is going to scale and that we're going to get many, many launches and many things being launched. So let's talk about that not happening. I feel like that's sticking your head in the mud at this point. I think we need to accept that that's going to happen and then talk about how can we do that in a way today where we still hopefully possibly have the capacity to chart a path forward where that's done responsibly. So that's kind of my view on it. And as maybe a final note, an idea that we've been toying with is, for instance, whether the components that are on our platform, we can give, for instance, something like a sustainability rating and force part of the procurement process to account for this so that there is an explicit decision being made to say, you can do this. So I live in the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands now, if you're a consumer and you buy an energy contract, you are explicitly confronted with this is 100% renewable energy, this is mixed, right? It's part what the gray energy, part green, or this is completely gray. And you get to decide as a consumer, do I want 100% green? For whatever reason, am I going to pay for stuff that might still be coming out of coal plants or natural gas? So maybe there's a way to create a forcing function like that in the marketplace that causes people to think about sustainability. But I think this is an example of where we should probably also have more people enter the workforce that have this competence and expertise to help the sector figure this out, basically.
Just a little heads up, we have to start packing up, like, now.
Oh, now?
So
All right.
if you,
Okay.
I don't know if there's one more question you want to answer, like, really quickly?
Yeah, I think that's all the questions that were in the chat.
Okay.
I don't know.
Looks like you might have a question.
No.
Okay.
I'm not, I don't know how sustainable spaceships work, so I feel like that's like a later problem. I don't know, I feel like it's like a down the road type thing.
Yeah.
I was wondering about all these like salespeople you say you need. Like, I mean, it sounds like an unmet demand. Like, what would you do with all those salespeople? Like, what's not getting sold?
So it's a question of, so this is digging a little bit into the weeds, and maybe I'll conclude this in a short minute since we have to pack up and we can talk more about it as well. But what I think we've noticed is that the friction that exists in the buying and selling process also relies on the competence of the people who are completing the transactions, right? And the question is, do you want an engineer that is now a salesperson who perhaps, I'm not saying that an engineer can't become a salesperson, because that happens in a lot of industries, but you have an engineer who's become a salesperson because they drew the short straw, then you can think about, well, is it maybe better to have that engineer work on the engineering stuff that they love and they're great at, and have a salesperson fulfill that role? And the question is, would that mean that you get sales closing faster, procurement happening faster, things getting to orbit faster? And it's a small piece of the cog of, like, in my view, for instance, you see some procurement cycles lasting upwards of a year. And I believe that part of that is just the complexity of the procurement, but part of it is also the skill in the buying and selling process. And perhaps if that expertise came in, we'd see those timelines maybe be halved or maybe be reduced by even 30%. And as a result, you see spacecraft get to orbit 10%, 20%, 50% faster. That means, we see just more scale, more things contributing to scale. So that's kind of my thought on that. So, okay, so whoever, I see a few people here commenting, just connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me just by my name, I'm pretty sure. And just shoot me a message, because I guess we have to run out of here. But thanks for tuning in. I don't know if you want to...
Thanks everybody. So we have a tour of Hudson Space Systems in the next couple weeks, so we'll get to go see their facilities over in Hoboken. They're building reusable rockets for microgravity research. We have Rogue Space, which is where Sadia is at. There's going to be a talk there. It's scheduled for November 2nd, but it's not 100% yet. And then I feel like we have one more, but I'm forgetting what it is. So just check us out on Meetup and stay tuned for more stuff, and be sure to follow Kartik's Satsearch story as the market's just about to really take off, I think. So thanks, guys. Thanks
Thanks a
Kartik.
lot, Matt.
Yeah.